When is the last time that you heard the full story of David and Goliath? It's been a while, hasn't it? And actually, that was not even the full story. I cut it off a little bit early. Many thanks to Lori and Mike Burke for reading it for us. We hear it a little bit differently as adults than we do as children, don't we? When we learn it as a child, the story of David and Goliath kind of gets boiled down to a simple message. God uses ordinary people and unlikely means to accomplish improbable feats. God uses ordinary people and unlikely means to accomplish improbable feats. But is David really that ordinary? And is his means that unlikely? And is his feat that improbable? David is really not that ordinary because David willingly volunteers to go up against Goliath. Goliath, who was supposed to be the warrior of all warriors in the Philistine army. This was the enemy that Israel has been trying to defeat for a very long time. In fact, if you'll remember from 2 weeks ago, the whole reason that the Israelites demanded a king is that they wanted somebody to help them defeat the Philistines. That's why Saul became king. But guess what? Saul has not defeated the Philistines. He has been too scared. He didn't put himself before Goliath. And yet, here was young David, willing to go before this giant of a threat. He could have just stayed with his sheep and been safe and fine, and nobody would have thought twice about it, because really, he was a shepherd boy. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. At least not yet. He's also not that ordinary because just before our text today, David had been picked out by Samuel in a lineup against all of his other brothers, his older and stronger and more fit for battle brothers, to become the next king after Saul. At this point, all we know about David is that he's been anointed now to be king, but really he is just a shepherd and a songwriter, and he can soothe Saul with his music. Not exactly strong military credentials. Surprisingly, though, the gentle David of 1 Samuel chapter 16 really turns quite barbaric at the end of chapter 17, doesn't he? We did not read it, but verse 51 has David cutting off Goliath's head and taking it back with him to Jerusalem as a sort of trophy prize, bragging rights, if you will. Now, like the image on the cover of your order of worship, we have this image, I think, many of us, of David being this small boy with a slingshot, very innocent and naive almost. But shepherds were not weak, nor were they naive. As David himself said in the text, he knew what it was to go head-to-head with lions and bears. He was not that ordinary. He was brave, willing to go before Goliath, and his means was not that unlikely. Let me tell you what I mean. Scholars talk about battle back in these days of having three kinds of warriors. There's cavalry, so the people on horseback and with chariots. There's heavy infantry, which are soldiers, armed foot soldiers with swords and armor. And then there's artillery, which could be archers, but more importantly, slingers. And a slinger is someone who has a leather pouch with two long cords coming off of it, and they put like a rock into it, and they swing it around, sometimes 6 or 7 revolutions per second. And when they let that rock go, it's going probably 35 meters per second. That is substantially faster than a baseball thrown by even the finest of baseball pitchers. More than that, the specific stones in the valley where this battle takes place are not normal rocks. They are barium sulfate, which is twice the density of normal stones. And so I'm told by these experts of these military days that if you do the calculations on those ballistics, on the stopping power of that rock when it hits Goliath's head, it's roughly equal to the stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun. That is not exactly a child's toy, is it? It's a devastating weapon. And we know from historical records that experienced slingers could be really specific with their target. They could even hit birds that were moving in flight. And so when David stands before Goliath, he has every intention and every expectation of being able to hit Goliath in that most vulnerable spot between his eyes. And if you go back over the history of ancient warfare, you'll find that time and time again, slingers were often the decisive factor against infantry. They were the ones who helped clinch the battle. So not only was David not that ordinary and his means not that unlikely, his feat wasn't that improbable, once you consider a few things about Goliath. Goliath might not have been as mighty as he might have seemed to be at first. So he was not artillery. He would be one of those heavy infantrymen, right? He had all the armor on, all the swords and the shields, and he thought he would be engaging in hand-to-hand combat. That's why he kept telling David to come to me. This is also what Saul clearly thought, because Saul gives David his armor to put on, right? And David gets weighed down and wobbly and says, I can't wear this. David knows that he needs to be agile for his artillery, for the kinds of movement he needs to make in battle. The other thing about Goliath, besides the fact that he is a giant and he's weighed down by hundreds of pounds of armor, is that, as popular author Malcolm Gladwell says, he may have also had a condition, a medical condition called acromegaly. Basically, it's something to do with the pituitary gland that makes you grow and grow and grow, and it also affects your eyesight. So when Goliath was saying, come to me, David, it wasn't just because he wanted to be in hand-to-hand combat. He also probably could not see him. He also thinks David has multiple sticks when David has one stick. And he also has an attendant guide him out onto the battlefield, which, why would he have that if he could see? Now, we really don't know if all of these things are true, right? It's speculation. But it is cause for us to pause and think a little bit more deeply about the story of David and Goliath. The point of all this is that, when the Israelites are up on the mountain ridge looking down on Goliath, they thought he was this extraordinarily powerful enemy. But they didn't have the full picture. Now, did David know all this about Goliath? Probably not. He still probably looked like a big, scary giant in a lot of armor to David. But David did know that he was really good with a sling. So he's not as weak and as vulnerable as we all imagine him to be from our childhood story Bibles. But even more than his skill, he also had courage. And his courage came quite directly, the text says, from God. David says, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me. And you, Goliath, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord my God. I come to you in the name of the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This idea of invoking God's name and God being on our side is the context of the biblical authors, and especially of those writing the history of Israel in books like 1st and 2nd Samuel. But theologically speaking, committing violence in the name of God and saying that God is on my side, I think, is troubling to me, perhaps to many of you today, isn't it? And this is because, number one, it implies that God is not on the side of whoever you are against. It makes me think of all those high school football teams praying in the locker room before their big game, when right on the other side of the field, the other team is in their locker room praying before the big game for God to be on their side. Another reason is that it implies that God actually divides people up into sides to begin with, which is really the opposite theology of what the Apostle Paul tried so hard to break down, right? There's no longer Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. We are one in Christ Jesus. See, the Old Testament has violence that the writers say is divinely sanctioned. But in the New Testament, we get a different message. We have a couple of examples when the followers of Jesus wanted to use violent means for their cause. One is when James and John wanted to call down fire upon the Samaritans because of their unbelief. And another is in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus' disciples tried to prevent his arrest. And in both of these instances, Jesus rebukes those who try to show their allegiance to him through violent means. Instead, Jesus insists that his Father in heaven causes the sun to shine on both the wicked and the righteous. And he tells us to love our enemies and to do good to those who persecute us, because in the end, the ultimate measure of our love for God is our love for our neighbor, and even, he says, our love for our enemy. That's in the Bible. Love for our enemy. Now, I feel like it's important to say all of this because I don't want us to take the story of David and Goliath and to use it as a means for violence or war against our enemy in the name of God. While certainly there are acts of war and violence being committed every day, putting God's name on those is not fair to God, especially now that we have the revelation of God in Jesus. We have this embodied understanding of God. An understanding of God that David and the Israelites did not have. And that makes a difference, right? It keeps us from naming violence or war, even if we think it's just, as something that God condones. German pastor Martin Niemöller went before Hitler and protested his anti-Semitic measures in person to him. You can imagine what happened. He was arrested and imprisoned. And during that time of imprisonment, he came to confess that, it took me a long time to learn this, but God is not the enemy of my enemies. God is not even the enemy of his enemies. God can't have enemies because by his nature, God is creator and redeemer, not enemy. That's a lot to wrap your head around. I've been thinking about it all week, and I still haven't wrapped my head around it. Another more popular theologian, Anne Lamott, says the same thing a little bit different way. She says, when God hates all the same people that you hate, you can be absolutely certain that you have created God in your image. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if God hated all the people that we hated? That would make us awfully self-righteous, wouldn't it? The bottom line is that we may not agree with the use of God's name to condone violence, but the truth is, I think we can agree that we live in a world where we often think of God as on our side, right? At least maybe God being partial to our way of thinking or believing. The basic human instincts reflected in the story of David and Goliath are still within us. And we struggle with them every day, even if we aren't slinging stones or going to battle. We want to believe that we are right. We want to believe that the bad guys will be defeated and the good guys will win. What is beautiful about David's strength in this story is that it comes not from might, but from the courage God puts within him, the courage of faith. When he takes off the armor of Saul, David refuses to be someone he is not, and he enters this difficult situation with confidence in who God has created him to be and how God has uniquely gifted him. Trying to be somebody else, trying to wear someone else's clothing, even if it's protective armor, was a hindrance, not a help. When David sticks with what he knows, when he sticks with what God has given him, that he is successful. We don't know what would have happened should he have kept the armor on, but he knew that he wouldn't have felt like himself, and he knew that God had equipped him differently. You know, when we face something that we fear, we often try to take the advice of others. When I wonder if we might just be needing to listen to the advice of God, meaning listen to how God is speaking to us and equipping us for whatever we are facing. To sit before God in prayer before we ever place ourselves before our fears. I think that facing God sometimes takes way more courage than facing our Goliaths. And by Goliaths, I don't mean giant Philistine military men. The Goliaths we face are often not people. Maybe they're issues or decisions or fears or obstacles that seem too big for us to face, too big for us to wrap our minds around, something so difficult that we don't even want to come before it and try to face it. Now, your Goliath could be something very personal, like an illness, or a grief, a career decision, an addiction. Your Goliath could be something interpersonal, like a relationship struggle, or whatever the elephant in the room is at your Thanksgiving dinners, or a resentment with a colleague, or a conflict with a neighbor where you live. And then we have those collective Goliaths, don't we? Especially as Christians. Like how to raise our voices in the face of injustice. We cannot help but think about this past 2 weeks when we are struggling collectively as a nation on how to help honor the dignity of all people, welcome those who are immigrants and refugees, while also forming policies that provide safety and resources for those who are already here and those who are yet to come. We are facing this Goliath of a problem, sometimes without seeing the faces of the people before us. And the thing is, when we're facing something so big and we don't know what to do about it, we can get so consumed with anxiety and fear that we freeze, or we retreat, or we throw up our hands and say, I give up. This is what the Israelites were doing before David came along. I wonder, though, if things might change if we focused not on facing our Goliaths head on, but rather on facing God head on, before trying to look at our Goliaths. Meaning, what would happen if we looked at God, looked at Christ, and used the life and love of Jesus as the inspiration and courage to face whatever we need to face? The strength of David is not in his slingshot, it is in his faith. Do you remember who David was before this moment? He wasn't always just out practicing his slingshot in the fields with the sheep. He was playing his lyre and praying to God, writing the Psalms, voicing his praises and his laments. He had a depth to his faith that seemed to be beyond his peers. It doesn't mean he wasn't susceptible to temptation. You heard him ask his brothers twice what the reward was for slaying Goliath. His motives certainly were not all pure, but lucky for us, God does not have to have perfection to work through us and in us. God merely asks for our persistence in our faith, our passion and our justice, our prayerfulness and our actions, and our practice and our preparation, just as David did, using the gifts that God has given us. You know, I suppose a key question from the story of David and Goliath is this: do we, like David, face God first before facing our Goliath? Or said in a different way, do we seek to honor God in all that we do and to honor all of God's children? Or do we just seek to take down our Goliaths? Chances are, if we glance at God first, we will see our Goliaths in a whole new light. Perhaps not as an enemy to be defeated, but something to be transformed. Because God is in the business of redemption, not retaliation. And I'll just say that redemption also means recognizing when we are the Goliath in the story. When we are the one that other people see as an obstacle or an enemy. We aren't always David, as much as we like to think we are. Sometimes we are Goliath. And in that case, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean for us to turn to God so that we can see the people standing before us as ones in need of hope and not hate? How do we turn to God and not to our Goliath selves, our Goliath power and our Goliath privilege and our Goliath strength? Whether we see ourselves as David facing up at Goliath, or as Goliath facing down David, what would happen first if we faced God? Would we realize that the face before us is really the face of Christ, and that our face reflects Christ to the one before us? I wonder how we would act then. Amen.